this is Baalbek in the Lebanon. Each of these 3 blocks weighs 900 tons.
But Baalbek, if there was one example, one ancient site on Earth that is evidence of a lost, ancient, advanced civilization,
something about this ancient temple should not be possible. It is not the age or the beauty that stops you. It is what sits beneath the columns. 3 stone blocks, each weighing nearly 800 tons, were raised about 20 feet into the air and set so tightly that 2,000 years of earthquakes have not opened a single gap.
And Baalbek has the largest stones that were ever quarried in human history, the largest stones that were lifted, stacked, and transported in human history, and the largest stone columns in all of classical history.
And when you see how impossible that should be, you start to realize that Baalbek's real story is not the one we were taught. The stones and the hill that shouldn't exist. The town of Baalbek sits on a low hill in the Bekaa Valley of eastern Lebanon, in a wide, high plain of farms and small towns. It is about 3,700 feet above sea level and roughly 50 miles inland from the coast. But what really stands out is the block of ruins that rises over the modern streets. People have been living on this hill for a very long time. Excavations have found early farming remains and pottery from the early Bronze Age, which show that a town already stood here more than 4,000 years ago. Later, it was linked to a storm and sky god. Under Greek and then Roman rule, it took the name Heliopolis, the city of the sun, becoming one of the major holy places of the eastern provinces. Today, Baalbek is listed as a World Heritage Site, known for having some of the best preserved Roman temples anywhere in the Mediterranean. When you walk into the main sacred area, the scale is obvious. The stones are not just large, they feel too large for normal, even by Roman standards. On the highest part of the hill stands the main temple group. One huge temple was for Jupiter, the chief god of the place. Another, slightly smaller but very well preserved, was for Bacchus, a god of wine and celebration. A third, smaller and curved, was for Venus. Seen from a distance, the tall columns and wide steps look like other Roman temples, just stacked higher and closer together. It is easy to think the whole mystery ends there, with fine stonework and grand design. The real puzzle sits underneath. Under the line of giant columns of the Jupiter temple, there is a vast man-made stone platform. It works like a giant box that holds back the edge of the hill and carries an artificial terrace on its back. This is not just a skin of stone wrapped around earth. It is a deep retaining wall made from stacked limestone blocks, each one fitted into the next. Along the lowest course of this wall, builders used very large stones. Many of them are roughly 30 to 40 feet long and weigh several hundred tons. They run around the outer edge of the terrace like a belt and form the base step of the box. Above them, on the western side, comes the most famous row of all. Here, 3 blocks stand in one line that has drawn writers and visitors for centuries. People today often call them the trilithon, a word that simply means 3 stones. Each block is more than 60 feet long. Each is about 14 feet high and around 12 feet thick from front to back. Measurements of their size and the density of the limestone give an estimated weight between roughly 750 and 800 tons for each stone. Very few finished buildings in history have ever used single blocks this large. These 3 stones are not showpieces. They are part of the working body of the wall. They sit on top of the lower course and under other heavy blocks, helping to hold the terrace together and carry the weight of the temple that once stood above. The stones did not come from under the temple. They were cut in a separate limestone quarry at the edge of the town. That quarry is known as Hajar al-Hibla, the stone of the pregnant woman. It lies a little over half a mile from the temple complex and sits slightly higher than the sanctuary, on the slope above the modern houses. Today it looks like a wide-open pit cut into pale rock, with shelves and trenches where workers carved out blocks in the past. In one corner of the quarry lies the block that gave the place its name. It is a single stone still partly attached to the bedrock. Its visible faces have been squared and smoothed. One end lies in the open air, while the far end disappears under soil and rubble. Survey teams in the 1990s measured its length and height and, using the known density of the limestone, estimated its weight at around 1,000 tons. Archaeologists returned to this quarry in the early 2000s as part of a joint project by the German Archaeological Institute and the Lebanese University. In 2014, as they dug below the famous block, they found the upper edge of another huge stone lying directly under it. Once enough of its sides were exposed to measure, they saw that this hidden block was even larger. It is about 64 feet long, close to 19 feet wide, and at least 18 feet high, and calculations based on those measurements give an estimated estimated weight of about 1,650 tons, making it one of the biggest single-worked stones known. The same quarry also holds a third very large block, often called the Stone of the South. It is slightly shorter than the others, but still close to 60 feet long, and estimates put its weight at around 1,200 tons. The stones up at the temple prove that builders in the Roman period could move and set blocks in the same weight range as the trilithon. The two giants in the quarry are even larger, which means the team in charge here was willing to plan something more daring than anything that survives in the temple wall. When the German and Lebanese teams studied the lower parts of the quarry stones, they found cracks and weak zones in the rock. They concluded that the blocks were abandoned for practical reasons. Once flaws showed up in the base, the risk of breaking the stone during lifting or transport was too high, so the safer answer was to leave it in place and cut a new block nearby. To see how this fits into the wider story of the site, you have to look under the temple terrace, as well as around it. The stone platform that carries the Jupiter temple is not the first major structure on this spot. Deep trenches cut along the edge of the great courtyard have shown that under the Roman paving, there is an older floor level several yards lower than the one visitors use today. Beneath the later surface, archaeologists have found an earlier freestanding stone podium and an old stairway that led up to it. Together, they point to an earlier entrance and an earlier terrace that were later buried inside the much larger Roman building project. There is still one thing the stones themselves cannot tell us. No ancient writer left a clear note that says how the largest blocks were taken from the quarry and set into the western wall. Modern teams can show where the stones came from, where they ended up, and how the hill grew through different building phases. What we still do not have is the simple, practical answer that hangs over the site today. How do you actually cut, move, and set a single stone that weighs as much as a small warship? Engineering on the edge. How do you move an 800-ton block? To get a sense of scale, it helps to compare. At most Roman building sites, the heavy blocks weigh in the range of a few tens of tons. That is still a serious weight, but it sits inside the safe zone for normal Roman cranes and lifting gear. When the Romans brought Egyptian obelisks to their cities, they pushed that higher. The Great Lateran Obelisk in Rome originally weighed a little over 400 tons before it broke and was re-erected shorter, and the famous Vatican obelisk is usually estimated at a little over 300 tons. Those were trophy projects for emperors, the kind of moves that made people write books and carve pictures. Now jump to the modern world. The fixed gantry crane called Typhoon at a shipyard in Yantai, China, holds the record for the heaviest lift ever done by a crane, at about 20,000 tons. It is as tall as a high building and costs tens of millions of dollars to build, and it only works inside 1 yard. Even today, lifting a single 800-ton solid block would not be a casual job. You would bring in custom gear, heavy steel frames, computer models, and a lot of planning. The trilithon stones at Baalbek sit right between those worlds. They are far beyond the normal comfort zone of Roman cranes, but far below the wild record lifts of modern shipyards. That middle ground means the job is not outright impossible, but every step is at the edge of what rope, wood, iron, and human muscle can handle. Before you can move a block, you have to free it from the hill. Quarrying limestone on a normal scale is a known craft. You mark out a rectangle on the bedrock, cut trenches along the sides and ends with iron picks and chisels, and then undercut the base. Into those cuts you drive wedges. Some are metal, some are dry wooden wedges that swell when you wet them. As the wedges bite, tiny cracks spread through the rock along the lines the mason planned. After enough rounds of hammering and wetting, the stone pops free. On very large blocks, you can still see how this worked. At Hajar al-Hibla, the faces of the giant unfinished stones show long trenches and neat rows of wedge slots along their sides and bottoms. These are not the marks of some unknown cutting beam. They match what we see at other Roman quarries: repeated blows from iron tools and systematic rows of wedges. Raised bosses or lumps of stone were sometimes left on the sides of a block. Those bosses could be used later as grabbing points for levers or ropes. By the time the Baalbek podium was built, iron was standard in the Roman building world. Writers like Vitruvius describe iron tools, pulleys, and hoists, and finds from places like Rome and the Rhine show that builders also used big wooden wheel machines powered by men walking inside them. Even the largest known Roman cranes, though, top out at lifts around 100 tons. That is impressive, but a single free-hanging crane was never going to lift an 800-ton block straight into the air. The trick had to be different. The key move is to turn a pure lift into a slow slide. The quarry that gave Baalbek its huge stones sits a short distance from the temple terrace, roughly half a mile away, and slightly higher than the podium. That means the builders did not have to raise the blocks from low ground to high ground. Instead, they had to cut them free, support them, and then guide them across a gentle drop in height without letting them rush out of control. Most modern reconstructions start the same way. You take the freed block and build a heavy wooden cradle or sledge around it. A sledge is just a strong frame with wide wooden runners on the bottom that slide rather than roll. The stone does not sit bare on the ground. The wood spreads its weight out over a larger area. Under the runners you can lay beams or planks, and in some spots, where the load is lighter for a moment, you can still use logs as rollers to help the frame move. Simple round logs on their own would crush like matchsticks under an 800-ton block, but that does not mean wood is useless. What matters is how you spread the load. If the runners of the sledge are wide, and if there is a thick bed of packed earth or planks under them, the pressure on any one point of wood can drop to something that oak and pine can survive. Once you reach that zone, friction becomes the main problem. On dry sand or rough rock, friction is brutal. Modern lab work on heavy sledges in sand, done by physicists in the Netherlands, showed that if you pull a stone sledge over loose dry sand, the front of the sled digs in, builds up a ridge, and fights every step. When they wet the sand just enough to bind the grains, the ridge vanished, and the pulling force dropped by almost half. That small trick doubled the useful strength of a team without adding a single person. A heavy pull like this does not rely on raw men pulling on ropes in a straight line. Roman engineers had devices called capstans and windlasses. A capstan is a vertical wooden drum set into the ground. Long horizontal bars stick out from it like the spokes of a wheel. Men or animals push the bars around in a circle. As the drum turns, it winds up a rope. Because the drum is much larger than the rope and the bars are long, you trade speed for power. A small push on the bar turns into a steady, very strong pull on the rope. In one classic study of Baalbek, the French archaeologist and architect Jean-Pierre Adam drew a reconstruction where a line of capstans stood along the route and around the podium. Each capstan had teams of men walking in circles, turning the drums. The ropes from these drums ran through sets of pulleys to the sledge. With many capstans working at once, you could build up a huge combined pull, far stronger than a crowd just yanking on bare ropes. The stone might move only a few inches each time the crews pushed, and that was fine. Slow is safe. Gravity helped and threatened at the same time. Because the quarry sits a bit higher, the engineers could arrange things so that once the block started moving along the ramp, part of its own weight helped it forward. On a well-graded slope, crews at the front would hold it back with capstans and ropes, while crews at the rear added just enough pull to keep it from stopping. If the slope grew too steep in any section, they could build up the track with more earth or stone to flatten the path. As the block neared the terrace, the job changed again from long-range hauling to close-up placement. This is where the usual image of a giant crane lifting the whole stone straight into the air breaks down. Even if you could build such a crane from timber, the risks would be insane. The better approach is to avoid a free lift and instead turn the whole hill into a temporary support structure. A simple way to picture it is to think of building the retaining wall and terrace in layers. First, crews set the lower courses of big blocks, the ones beneath the trilithon, while the back of the wall is buried under packed earth. Behind that, they extend the fill and build a temporary working platform out from the slope. At some point, the surface of that fill sits level with the planned height of the trilithon blocks. Now the 800-ton stone does not need to be lifted from ground level to the top of the wall. It just needs to be slid sideways from the temporary platform into its slot in the outer face. Workers can use thick wooden rollers under the sledge for these last feet, because the load is spread by the frame and the distance is short. Iron pry bars, also known as crowbars or pinch bars, are inserted into shallow sockets cut into the stone base and sides. Using those levers and stacks of wooden cribbing blocks, crews can raise or lower one end of the stone by a fraction of an inch at a time. Cribbing is a simple trick. You stack short timbers in a crisscross pattern to make a low, strong tower. Slide a lever under the block, lift a little, pack another timber under, and let it rest. Repeat that move again and again, and you can ease a huge weight up or down in small, safe steps. It is slow, but it has one huge advantage. No single piece of wood ever has to hold the full weight alone. With the sledge sitting level with the top of the wall, and cribbing taking up any slight height changes, the crews could bring the block into contact with its neighbors. This is where precision kicks in. Roman and Near Eastern masons used a method called drafted margins, where they carefully smoothed a strip around the edge of each block face and left the center slightly recessed. When two blocks were pressed together, the smooth margins met and formed a tight joint, while the recessed center avoided random high spots. Getting that fit right on an 800-ton block took patience. You do not polish the full face at once. Instead, you bring the stone close. Look for high points where the margins touch too early. Mark them, pull the block back a little, and knock those spots down with chisels. Then you try again. Over many rounds, the stone sits deeper and deeper into its seat. The immense weight helps the process. Once the block touches along most of its length, its own mass crushes tiny irregularities and locks it in. Ancient engineers also use subtle shapes to help the structure hold together. Some blocks are slightly wider at the back than at the front, making them wedge into the wall. Others have small steps or tongues on their tops and bottoms that work like keys between courses. When thousands of tons of masonry press down from above, those shapes make it harder for an earthquake to slide a block sideways out of place. Baalbek is an extreme case of this mindset, but not a complete break from the rest of ancient stonework. It sits at the far high end of the same skills we see in city walls, harbor moles, and temple platforms all over the Mediterranean. No one has yet run a full-scale experiment with an 800-ton block over a half-mile route and up onto a high podium. Scholars studying ancient construction point out that even moving stones of about 500 tons at other sites took intricate staging, repeated adjustments, and very skilled crews. At Baalbek, all of that would have to work at once, for a very long time, with no big failure. If you want a sense of how tight that margin is, look at a later project with numerous records. In the late 1500s, the architect Domenico Fontana moved the Vatican obelisk in Rome, a single granite shaft weighing roughly 300 tons, across a short distance in St. Peter's Square. He built a huge wooden tower around it, used about 40 winches and complex pulley blocks, and supervised hundreds of workers and animals. The lowering, hauling, and raising took months of work and planning. And that was in the early modern period, with detailed drawings, metal fittings, and experience from many earlier projects. When modern engineers run through the numbers for Baalbek, using reasonable rope strengths, friction values, and human pulling power, the answer they get is not a clear no. Studies based on Roman building manuals and later heavy moves suggest that with enough capstans, pulley blocks, and time, the pull from several hundred men could inch an 800-ton sledge along a prepared track. But those same studies admit that the safety margins are thin. A small mistake in the slope, a weak beam inside a capstan, or a sudden rainstorm turning the ramp to mud could have been enough to ruin a stone or wreck the gear. Giants, Jinn, and the myths of Baalbek. For as long as people have lived around Baalbek, the huge stones have pulled stories out of them. When something looks too big for normal hands, people reach for bigger builders. In this place, that has meant giants, cursed sons of Adam, a king who spoke to spirits, and even the time before the Great Flood. Each story says more about the people telling it than about the actual builders. One of the oldest storylines starts with Cain, the son of Adam, who killed his brother. Some Christian and local writers in the Levant said Cain was sent east, wandered under a curse, and built his first city on this very hill to hide from the anger of God. In that version, Baalbek was not just a town. It was a safe house built by a murderer who wanted thick walls and heavy stones between himself and judgment. The story does not stop there. Another thread says that the first city fell in the Great Flood and lay in ruins, and that a king named Nimrod came later with a race of giants to raise it again. Nimrod shows up in old Near Eastern stories as a mighty hunter and a rebel who wanted to challenge heaven. In some versions tied to Baalbek, those giants rebuilt the hill as a tower, a sort of rival to the Tower of Babel, using stones so large that only superhuman hands could lift them. When the tower failed, the giants died, but the base blocks were left behind as a warning. By the time Islamic writers began to describe the ruins, the focus had shifted to a very different figure, King Solomon. In the Quran and later Muslim stories, Solomon is a wise ruler who can speak to animals and command beings called jinn. Jinn are unseen spirits made of smokeless fire in Islamic belief. They can build, travel, and carry heavy loads in ways normal people cannot. So it was almost natural that when people in the region tried to explain Baalbek, they said, Solomon did it with his jinn. In some of these tales, Solomon wanted a palace to impress the Queen of Sheba when she came to visit. He ordered the jinn to build a place that no other king on earth could match. They carved the giant stones, flew them through the air, and dropped them into place around a vast courtyard. After the queen left, the story says, the palace stood as a sign of his power over both humans and spirits. In another version, God became angry at Solomon's pride and sent fire from heaven that burned the palace down. Only parts of the foundation, including a line of the biggest stones, survived. The jinn themselves even get blamed for the broken plans still visible in the quarry. One popular local story says the giant blocks that lie unfinished outside the city were not abandoned because of cracks or bad rock. Instead, people said the jinn went on strike. They were tired of hauling stones for a human king, dropped their tools, and refused to finish the last course. These tales were not just told by villagers at night. Learned men wrote them down. A Maronite bishop in the early modern period repeated the claim that Baalbek began with Cain and was later rebuilt for him by a demon named Ismodai or Ashmedai under Solomon's orders. In that version, the huge fortress was both a gift and a prison, a place where Cain could live and a place where spirits worked out their punishment. Travel writers from Europe arrived with their own need for big answers. In the 1800s, the Scottish traveler David Urquhart wrote that the blocks paralyzed his mind. He could not accept that normal workers had cut and moved them. After turning every idea over in his head, he decided the ruins must be the work of people who lived before the Great Flood, the same age as Noah and the Ark. Some later readers even joked that he thought mastodons helped drag the stones. As time went on, every new wave of visitors added another rumor. Some said the blocks were laid out as part of a huge clock that marked the stars. Others claimed the platform was once used for dark rites, and that strange sounds could still be heard there on some nights. In the last century, fringe authors pushed the site into space, saying the terrace was a landing pad for gods or travelers from other worlds, and that the stones had to be so large to handle flying machines. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.